This has been weighing on me, and it's time to get it off my chest. The situation with my family was frustrating, but I never expected this. I'm Stella, 26. At my brother Connor's grand opening, Fedra handed him the keys to a brand new pub. Then she turned, smiled coldly, and handed me an apron telling me to mop his floors. They didn't know that apron was the last thing they'd ever force on me. Where are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below. And let's see if your family is as crazy as mine. The house in the suburbs was old, with peeling white paint and floorboards that groaned under the slightest weight. It wasn't much, but it was a sanctuary. It legally belonged to Aunt Cora, my mother's older sister. Cora was fragile, her hands twisted by severe arthritis, her voice barely above a whisper on her best days. To Fedra and David, my parents, Cora was nothing more than an inconvenient ghost. They saw her as a financial burden, a stain on their carefully curated image of a successful upper-middle-class family. They never visited. They never called to ask if she had eaten or if her prescriptions were filled. They simply abandoned her in that fading house, assuming someone else would deal with the mess. That someone else was me. Every morning before work, I bathed her. I organized her pills into those little plastic compartments. I made sure she had warm oatmeal and a cup of weak tea. I didn't do it out of obligation. I did it because Cora was the only person in my bloodline who looked at me like a human being, not a utility. She never asked me for money. She never demanded my time. She just smiled, her tired eyes full of quiet gratitude. Living in that house with her meant I was the designated shield. I took the brunt of the neglect so she wouldn't have to feel it. I paid the utility bills. I covered the property taxes. I managed the groceries. Fedra and David lived in a sprawling modern home just 40 minutes away, yet they acted as if Cora existed in a different dimension. Whenever Fedra did happen to call my phone, she never asked how her sister was doing. The conversations were always about what I could do for them, what spreadsheet I needed to fix, or what mess Connor had made that required my immediate attention. I learned very early on that in my family, you were only as valuable as the problems you could solve. Cora couldn't solve their problems, so she was discarded. I could solve them, so I was exploited. But sitting in that quiet, dusty living room with Cora listening to the ticking of the old grandfather clock, I realized something important. This house was a fortress for two women whom the family had thrown to the margins. We were the collateral damage of their vanity. I promised myself I would protect her no matter what they tried to do. I just didn't realize how soon that promise would be tested. The storm was coming. The grand opening of Connor's pub was a masterclass in financial delusion. The place was located in a flashy downtown district, all exposed brick neon signs and velvet booths that cost more than my car. The bass from the sound system rattled my teeth as I stood in the corner, clutching a glass of warm water. David was holding court near the bar, bragging loudly to anyone who would listen about the $120,000 bank loan he had secured to make his son's dream a reality. He wore a tailored suit, projecting the image of a titan of industry. But I knew the math. I always knew the math. That loan barely covered the lease and the premium liquor licenses. The reality was much darker, and it sat like a stone in my stomach. Just 3 weeks prior, Fedra had cornered me in my own kitchen. She hadn't asked. She had demanded. She needed $85,000 of my personal life savings. That was money I had bled for working double shifts as a restaurant manager and freelance accountant. It was the money I was saving to secure a proper, accessible ground-floor apartment for Aunt Cora. Fedra had used every manipulation tactic in the book. She cried. She threatened. She told me that family steps up, that Connor just needed this one chance to become a man, and that it was merely a temporary bridge loan. She made me feel like an absolute monster for even hesitating. Exhausted and worn down by years of conditioning, I had authorized the transfer. Now watching Connor drunkenly drop a crystal champagne flute on the hardwood floor and laugh about it, the sickness in my gut intensified. He was 22, had never held a real job for more than a month, and was now the proud owner of a high-end pub. He wore a designer watch bought with my sweat. Fedra floated through the crowd, accepting congratulations for raising such an entrepreneurial son. When she finally walked over to me, I expected a shred of acknowledgement, a quiet thank you. Instead, she shoved that humiliating custom-embroidered apron into my chest and told me to get to work on the spills. I looked at the apron. I looked at Connor, who was now ordering a round of top-shelf tequila for his freeloading friends. $85,000 of my safety net was evaporating into this chaotic, loud room. They hadn't just taken my money, they had taken my future security and handed it to a boy who treated life like an endless frat party. The sheer audacity of it burned through my chest. I didn't put the apron on. I folded it neatly, placed it on the nearest table, and walked toward the back office to escape the noise. I needed a moment to breathe, to calm the absolute rage boiling in my veins. Then I saw the invoices. The back office was a mess of unpacked boxes and scattered papers. I sat down at Connor's massive, unused mahogany desk, just trying to find a quiet place to steady my breathing. As a reflex, my eyes drifted to the open ledger and the stack of delivery receipts sitting next to the computer. It was a habit I couldn't break. I had been the family's unpaid bookkeeper for over a decade. But what I saw on those pages made my blood run entirely cold. The numbers didn't just look wrong, they looked illegal. There were massive discrepancies in the inventory logs. Connor was paying top dollar on the books for premium spirits, but the delivery manifests tucked underneath showed shipments of unmarked, untaxed boxes coming in through the back alley. Worse, I found a secondary payroll sheet. It was a handwritten list of names I didn't recognize next to hourly rates that were obscenely below minimum wage. Next to the ledger was a stack of thick, unmarked manila envelopes. I opened one. It was stuffed with cash. My brother wasn't just running a failing pub, he was employing undocumented workers under the table and moving illicit untaxed inventory to skim cash off the top. The liability was staggering. If the labor board or the financial authorities caught wind of this, the fines alone would bankrupt him, and the criminal charges would lead straight to prison. It was 11:45 at night. The music outside was still thumping, but inside that office, there was only the deafening silence of an impending disaster. I grabbed the papers and marched out to find Phaedra. I pulled her away from a group of her wealthy friends, ignoring her annoyed glare. I showed her the cash envelopes and the fake invoices. I explained, speaking clearly and methodically, that Connor was committing federal and state offenses. I told her the pub was a ticking time bomb. Phaedra didn't gasp. She didn't march over to confront her son. Instead, she snatched the papers from my hand, shoved them back into my purse, and laughed. A sharp, condescending laugh. She patted my cheek and told me to stop being such a dramatic buzzkill. She said Connor was just cutting some smart corners being a savvy businessman, and that I was simply jealous of his success because I was just a boring accountant. She ordered me to stop snooping and go back to cleaning the tables. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. She was actively choosing to protect her golden child's criminal behavior over the safety of the entire family's financial future. The $85,000 I had lent them was tied to this sinking ship. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I nodded, turned around, and walked right back into that office. I locked the door. I fired up the small scanner in the corner. I copied every single page. Sitting in the glow of the scanner bed, listening to the mechanical whir of the machine, copying evidence the memories washed over me. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. This was the culmination of a dynamic that had been silently crushing me since I was a child. I realized then that I had always been the machine, and Connor had always been the masterpiece. When I was 12 years old, David sat me down at the kitchen table and taught me how to balance his checkbook. He didn't do it to teach me financial literacy. He did it because he hated the math and wanted someone else to carry the stress. From that day on, I was the designated adult. If a bill was late, it was my fault for not reminding them. If the pantry was empty, it was my fault for not making a list. I absorbed their anxiety so they could pretend their lives were perfect. Connor, on the other hand, existed in a state of perpetual grace. He was 4 years younger than me, but the rules applied to him as if he were royalty. I vividly remembered a Saturday afternoon when I was 16. Connor had thrown a baseball through the neighbor's expensive greenhouse window. Instead of punishing him, Phaedra turned to me and demanded I use my summer job savings to cover the damages, claiming it was my fault for not watching him closely enough. I handed over $200. Connor got ice cream to calm his nerves. When I graduated high school with top honors, there was no party. David handed me a generic card and told me that hard work was its own reward. When Connor barely scraped by with passing grades 4 years later, they threw a catered backyard event and bought him a luxury watch. They justified it all with the same tired script. They told me I was the strong one, the capable one, the rock. They said Connor was sensitive and needed a little extra push. But sitting in that office holding the copied evidence of Connor's crimes, the truth stripped away all the illusions. Being the Rock was just their convenient excuse to use me. They didn't admire my strength, they exploited it. They loved Connor for who he was, and they only tolerated me for what I could produce. The $85,000 wasn't a loan to them. It was a tax I owed for the privilege of breathing their air. I carefully folded the copies and slid them into the hidden lining of my tote bag. I didn't feel sad anymore. The desperation for their approval, the desperate inner child begging for a scrap of their genuine affection finally went completely quiet. The emotional tether snapped. I gathered my things, stepped out into the chaotic, loud pub, and walked straight out the front door without saying a single word of goodbye. I stopped trying to please. The decline in Aunt Cora's health wasn't a sudden crash. It was a slow, agonizing fade. It started with a persistent cough that wouldn't clear, followed by days where simply walking from her bed to the kitchen left her gasping for air. The doctors were compassionate but realistic. Her lungs were failing. To keep her comfortable and safe at home, she needed a specialized oxygen concentrator, round-the-clock monitoring equipment, and a registered nurse to visit daily while I was at work. The medical supply company and the home care agency sent over their cost estimates on a crisp Tuesday morning. I sat at my kitchen table, a lukewarm cup of coffee in my hands, and stared at the final number at the bottom of the page. It was a staggering figure. Over the next 6 months, the out-of-pocket costs for Cora's sustained care would drain a massive amount of capital. It was practically the exact amount of money I had been coerced into handing over for Connor's pub. The irony was so sharp it felt physical, like a blade resting against my ribs. That $85,000 was supposed to be my safety net, a shield designed specifically for emergencies just like this one. Instead, it had been funneled into neon signs and imported liquor for a boy who had never worked an honest day in his life. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I simply folded the medical estimate, slid it into a clean manila envelope, and grabbed my car keys. I drove the 40 minutes out to the upscale gated community where Phaedra and David lived. The drive was a blur of manicured lawns and towering oak trees. Pulling into their wide, circular driveway, I parked my modest sedan behind David's gleaming new luxury SUV. The house looked like a spread from an architectural magazine, flawless, expensive, and utterly devoid of warmth. I let myself in through the front door, the heavy oak swinging open silently. The smell of expensive leather polish and imported vanilla candles hit me instantly. I walked through the grand foyer and found them in the sunroom. Phaedra was sitting on a plush, cream-colored sofa, leisurely sipping from a delicate porcelain teacup while scrolling through her tablet. David was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, meticulously wiping down a brand-new set of titanium golf clubs with a microfiber cloth. They looked perfectly at peace, entirely insulated by the money and effort they had extracted from me. I walked into the center of the room. Phaedra barely glanced up, her eyes still glued to the screen. David continued polishing his driver, humming a low, tuneless melody. I didn't wait for a greeting. I pulled the medical estimate from the envelope and placed it squarely on the glass coffee table right next to Phaedra's teacup. I told them Cora was failing. I explained the costs, and then keeping my voice entirely level. I told them I needed a partial repayment of the $85,000 they had taken from me to keep their sister alive. They finally looked at me. For a long moment, the only sound in the sunroom was the rhythmic ticking of an antique wall clock. Phaedra looked at the paper on the table as if someone had just placed a dead insect next to her tea. She didn't even bother to pick it up. Instead, she let out a short, breathy laugh, a sound so entirely devoid of empathy, it made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. She leaned back against the plush cushions, crossing her legs with a slow, deliberate grace. "Stella, are you actually listening to yourself?" Phaedra asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "You march in here on a Saturday morning and demand money like a debt collector. We are a family. Sisters and brothers help each other. That money doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to your brother now. It's an investment in the family name." David didn't even look up from his golf club. He just shook his head, running the cloth over the polished metal. "Your mother is right, Stella," he chimed in, his voice thick with annoyance. "You're making a fuss over pocket change in the grand scheme of things. Connor is building an empire. You're sitting here calculating pennies. It is your duty as the older sister to support him. That's what family does." The sheer absurdity of the trap they had built for me was finally laid bare. In their twisted reality, my life savings was merely pocket change when I needed it, but it was an essential investment when Connor demanded it. They had normalized this financial abuse so completely that they genuinely believed I was the villain for asking for my own money back. They had conditioned me to believe that my only value was my utility. "This isn't about Connor's pub," I said, keeping my voice remarkably steady. "This is about Cora. She needs medical care. She is your sister Fedra. She is suffocating in that house, and this money will keep her alive." Fedra's eyes hardened. The polite societal mask slipped, revealing the cold, calculating narcissism underneath. "Cora has lived her life, Stella," she said, her voice dropping into a harsh, venomous register. "She's a withered burden, and she has been for a decade. We are not going to halt Connor's future, the bright future of this family, to drag out the inevitable for an old woman who contributes nothing. You chose to live with her. You deal with the consequences." Inside my mind, a long, continuous beep sounded the flat line of an illusion, the hope that somewhere buried deep beneath their selfishness they harbored a shred of parental love or basic human decency finally died. They didn't see me as a daughter. They didn't see Cora as a sister. We were just liabilities, and Connor was the only asset they cared to insure. I looked at them both sitting in their luxury built on the foundation of my stolen security. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the glass coffee table, and I didn't break down into a sobbing fit of betrayal. The younger version of me, the girl who desperately craved their validation, who would have twisted herself into knots trying to prove her worth to them, might have begged. She might have pleaded with Fedra to show some mercy, or tried to logically argue with David about fairness and responsibility. But that girl was gone, buried under years of unbalanced ledgers and unreciprocated sacrifices. I looked at Fedra, noting the defensive cross of her arms. I looked at David, noting the way his knuckles were white as he gripped the golf club, implicitly ready to defend his wife's cruelty. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one suffocating in it. I felt an incredible crystalline clarity wash over me. Arguing with them was like trying to teach a hurricane to be gentle. It was a complete waste of energy. I leaned forward slowly and picked up the medical estimate from the table. I smoothed out a tiny crease in the corner of the paper with my thumb. My movements were methodical, precise, and completely devoid of the panic they were expecting. I could see a flicker of confusion pass over Fedra's face. She was waiting for the emotional explosion, the guilt-ridden apology, the inevitable retreat back into my designated role as the compliant martyr. "I understand," I said. My voice was quiet, stripped of any inflection. It wasn't a statement of agreement. It was an acknowledgement of their true nature. I finally understood the rules of the game they were playing. I turned around and walked out of the sunroom. I didn't rush. I didn't stomp my feet. My heels clicked evenly against the polished marble floor of the foyer. I heard David scoff loudly behind me, muttering something about my dramatic exits, but the words felt like static noise. They didn't matter anymore. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The sun felt warm against my face. As I walked down the driveway toward my car, a profound sense of liberation settled into my bones. The heavy, invisible chain of familial obligation that had been dragging me down for over a decade simply evaporated. They had made their choice. They had drawn their line in the sand, prioritizing an illusion over a life. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and placed the medical envelope on the passenger side. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there looking at the sprawling, soulless house in the rearview mirror. When the door clicked shut behind me, the dynamic had permanently shifted. I was no longer their obedient daughter, and I was no longer their silent ATM. I had just become their creditor. The first thing I did when I got back to Cora's house wasn't cry. I made a fresh pot of coffee, opened my laptop, and began the systematic dismantling of my financial ties to Fedra and David. Over the years, I had been manipulated into covering dozens of minor inconveniences for them. Because I was the organized one, my credit card was on file for their premium cable package. My bank account automatically drafted the supplemental fees for David's country club membership. I paid the annual premiums for Fedra's elite magazine subscriptions and their streaming services. They had framed it as managing the family admin, but it was just a slow, continuous bleed. I logged into every single portal. I clicked the settings icons. I found the billing profiles. One by one, I hit the cancel subscription and remove payment method buttons. It was a digital severing, and every click felt like taking a deep, unhindered breath. By noon, I had completely wiped my financial presence from their daily lives. If they wanted to watch movies or play golf, they would have to use the money they were supposedly making from Connor's brilliant new empire. The fallout was predictably swift. At exactly 8:30 p.m. the following evening, my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. Phaedra's name flashed on the screen. She wasn't calling to ask if Cora was breathing okay. She was calling because her premium cable had abruptly shut off in the middle of a Sunday night drama. The phone vibrated across the granite countertop, the sound loud and demanding. I didn't feel the usual spike of anxiety in my chest. I felt absolutely nothing. I reached out, pressed the red icon, and blocked her number. Then I blocked David's. I blocked Connor's. I set up a silent filter on my email. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. But silence didn't pay the medical bills. I needed cash, and I needed it fast. The next morning, I walked into the restaurant where I managed the books and told the owner I was taking over the weekend evening shifts on the floor. I reached out to 2 former clients and took on their freelance tax prep. I was working 14-hour days, moving between spreadsheets and restaurant tables until my feet went numb. I was exhausted, chronically underslept, and living off black coffee and adrenaline. But this exhaustion was entirely different from the fatigue I felt when I was serving my parents. This exhaustion belonged to me. Every dollar I made went directly into an account dedicated to Cora's oxygen tanks and home nursing care. I was building a wall around us brick by brick, hour by hour. I was entirely focused on survival. Phaedra and David thought they had left me scrambling in the dark, desperate and helpless. They had no idea what was sitting in my fireproof safe. My parents believed I was naive. They assumed that because I had always complied, I lacked the capacity for ruthlessness. They thought the $85,000 had simply vanished into the ether, a gift disguised as a loan secured only by the fragile bonds of guilt and family duty. They were entirely wrong. I had known for a very long time that Connor was a financial black hole, and I had known Phaedra would eventually try to throw my life savings into it. The night Phaedra cornered me in my kitchen, demanding the money for the pub, I hadn't just logged into my banking app and hit transfer. I had insisted on a meeting with Connor. I told them the bank flagged large unexplained transfers as potential money laundering and required formal documentation to clear the funds. It was a highly technical lie spoken with the dull bureaucratic tone of an accountant, and neither Phaedra nor Connor possessed the financial literacy to question it. We met at a coffee shop the next morning. I slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the table. It wasn't a casual IOU. It was a fully formalized commercial promissory note. Embedded deep within the dense legal jargon, buried under clauses about amortization and default penalties, was a very specific ironclad provision. The document established a blanket lien against all business assets of the pub, explicitly naming me as the primary secured creditor in the event of default or bankruptcy. Connor hadn't even looked at the second page. He was too busy texting his friends about the VIP list for the opening night. He saw the space for his signature, grabbed a pen, and scribbled his name with an arrogant flourish. He didn't notice the quiet, sharply dressed woman sitting at the table next to us. She was a licensed notary public I had hired for $50. She slid her stamp over the paper, signed her name, and formalized the trap. Now sitting in my bedroom late at night, I opened the heavy steel door of my fireproof safe. I pulled out the crisp white document. The notary seal caught the light of the desk lamp. This piece of paper was a sleeping giant. It meant that Connor didn't really own the expensive velvet booths, the premium liquor inventory, or the state-of-the-art sound system. I did. Phaedra and David thought they were protecting their golden child's assets from the world, oblivious to the fact that I held the absolute legal right to liquidate his entire business the moment he missed a payment. I wasn't going to strike yet. A good accountant knows that timing is everything. You don't call in a debt when the debtor is flying high. You wait until they trip. You wait until the market corrects itself. Connor was arrogant, careless, and reckless. I knew he would eventually hang himself with the rope they had bought him. I put the contract back into the safe and locked it. I secured the commercial promissory note, but that was only half of the shield I needed to build. The other half was far more critical because it involved a human life. A week after I walked out of Phaedra's sunroom, I took a rare morning off from the restaurant. I dressed in a sharp, understated blazer, gathered a thick accordion folder full of documents, and drove to a small, reputable law firm in the city. The office smelled of old parchment and strong coffee, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of my parents' home. I sat across a heavy oak desk from Mrs. Vance, a no-nonsense family law attorney with sharp eyes and a reassuring, methodical demeanor. I didn't waste her time with emotional grievances. I opened the folder and laid out the facts. I presented 3 years of Aunt Cora's medical records, detailed logs of her daily care, and a meticulously organized ledger of every prescription utility bill and grocery receipt I had paid to keep her alive. Then I presented the void. I showed Mrs. Vance the complete and utter lack of involvement from Fedra and David. There were no visitation records, no financial contributions, and no emergency contacts listing them as viable caregivers. I explained that Cora's cognitive and physical decline required a dedicated guardian, and her biological sister had explicitly refused to provide any support, labeling her a withered burden. Mrs. Vance reviewed the paperwork in silence. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mix of professional approval and quiet sympathy. She explained that petitioning the court for full power of attorney, both medical and financial, over a living relative was a rigorous process. It required proving not only Cora's incapacitation, but also my parents' negligent abandonment. I told her I had every receipt, every blocked call log, and a notarized affidavit from Cora's visiting nurse, confirming my sole role as her caregiver. The strategy was simple, but airtight. We were going to establish in the eyes of the law that I was the only person standing between Aunt Cora and total destitution. By filing the petition, we were preemptively blocking Fedra and David from ever trying to weaponize Cora's remaining assets for their own gain. We signed the initial paperwork that morning. The legal machinery began to turn. 3 relentless months of gathering medical files, and I was just waiting for the judge's gavel to fall. Late that evening, the house was profoundly quiet, save for the rhythmic, comforting hum of Cora's oxygen concentrator. I sat in the armchair beside her bed, watching her chest rise and fall. The soft amber glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room. Cora was asleep, her fragile, paper-thin fingers resting loosely on top of a handmade quilt. Looking at her, a deep philosophical clarity settled over my mind, washing away the last lingering remnants of my childhood conditioning. For 26 years, I had been trapped in the illusion of biological duty. Society teaches us that blood is an unbreakable bond, a sacred contract that dictates our loyalties. We are told to forgive our parents simply because they gave us breath. But sitting in that quiet room, I realized how incredibly flawed that logic was. Biology is merely a genetic blueprint. It doesn't build a home. It doesn't guarantee respect, and it certainly doesn't excuse chronic exploitation. Fedra and David shared my DNA, but they had never been a family to me. They were a corporation, and I was just an unpaid employee working desperately to earn a promotion that didn't exist. I had spent my entire life trying to buy their love by being useful, terrified of becoming disposable like Cora. I had allowed them to drain my bank accounts and my spirit, all for the fleeting hope that one day they would look at me with the same pride they blindly showered on Connor. But love shouldn't be a transactional currency. Love is a choice. It was the choice I made every morning when I prepared Cora's medication. It was the choice she made when she listened to me talk about my day, offering a gentle smile instead of a critique. The agonizing desperation I had felt for my parents' approval slowly evaporated into the quiet air. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate requires emotional energy, and I had none left to give them. I simply let them go. The cord was cut. I felt an incredible lightness in my chest, a profound sense of emptiness that wasn't lonely but liberating. I was completely hollowed out, unburdened by guilt, and entirely ready for the storm that was about to break. While I was building my fortress in the suburbs, the Golden Child's empire was rapidly rotting from the inside out. The decline of Connor's pub wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, humiliating bleed entirely visible to anyone paying attention. I didn't need to visit the venue to know it was failing. The digital footprint told the entire story. Initially, Connor's social media feeds were flooded with arrogant posts, flashy photos of bottle service, crowded dance floors, and VIP wristbands. But within a few months, the posts grew sparse. Online reviews began to plummet. Patrons complained about watered-down drinks, aggressive security, and an atmosphere that felt chaotic and mismanaged. But the most damning indicators were the whispers within the local hospitality industry. Word travels fast when vendors aren't paid. The premium liquor distributors cut him off, forcing him to rely completely on the unmarked illicit inventory I had documented on opening night. Bartenders and waitstaff began walking out mid-shift, leaving angry reviews about bounced paychecks and envelopes of cash that were suspiciously light. Connor lacked the basic discipline to run a business. He treated the pub's revenue like a personal ATM, draining the registers to fund his lifestyle while the operational debts piled up like a mountain. And then the heavy machinery of consequence began to turn on Phaedra and David. The $120,000 bank loan David had proudly secured wasn't a static number. The grace period ended, and the monthly amortization payments hit their accounts. Connor, of course, couldn't produce a dime to cover the overhead. The financial pressure, once theoretical, was now a very real, very aggressive vice tightening around my parents' meticulously curated lives. My phone, safely filtered, began to capture their rising panic. I routinely checked my blocked voicemail folder, not out of concern but for situational awareness. The messages evolved from Phaedra's annoyed demands for me to come fix Connor's spreadsheets, to David's furious, strained orders to call us back immediately. This is a family emergency. They were drowning in the exact mess they had created. They were frantically looking for their life raft. But I had already cut the anchor. The inevitable collapse arrived on a rainy Friday night. I wasn't there to witness it, but the aftermath was broadcasted clearly enough for the entire city to see. Connor's reckless arrogance had finally attracted the wrong kind of attention. You can ignore angry Yelp reviews, but you cannot ignore the federal government. At approximately 1:30 p.m., while the pub was packed with its usual chaotic weekend crowd, the music was abruptly cut. The flashing red and blue lights of law enforcement vehicles illuminated the slick, wet pavement outside the venue. This wasn't a routine noise complaint. It was a coordinated multi-agency raid. Agents from the Department of Labor, accompanied by financial regulators and local police, walked through the front doors holding clipboards and warrants. They didn't draw weapons. They drew audit files. The operation was clinical and devastatingly thorough. They seized the registers, the computers, and the illicit inventory hidden in the back storage rooms. The undocumented workers Connor had been exploiting were questioned, exposing the gross violations of labor laws and the under-the-table cash payments I had photographed months prior. Connor's illusion of being a business mogul was shattered under the harsh, fluorescent lights of a legal audit. He was escorted out the back door, his hands cuffed, looking bewildered and remarkably small, without his expensive watch and his mother's praises. He was booked on multiple counts of economic fraud, tax evasion, and severe labor code violations. The venue was immediately shut down, the heavy glass doors wrapped tightly in stark yellow caution tape. I didn't find out until the next morning. I was sitting at my kitchen counter, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. I turned on the local news channel. There was a brief segment about a downtown nightlife venue being shuttered due to a massive regulatory sting operation. The camera panned across the neon sign Connor had chosen, now dark and lifeless. I watched the broadcast at 7:00 a.m., taking a slow, steady sip of my tea. The first domino had fallen. The fallout from the raid was absolute carnage for my parents' finances. Connor's arrest wasn't just a public humiliation, it was the detonation of a financial bomb. With the pub permanently sealed by regulatory agencies, the business revenue instantly dropped to zero. But the debt remained. The $120,000 commercial loan David had signed for was still active, and the bank was aggressively demanding their monthly payments. Phaedra and David were trapped in a vice of their own making. Their sprawling, luxurious house in the gated community was already heavily mortgaged to support their lifestyle. They didn't have the liquid capital to bail Connor out of his legal mess, hire competent criminal defense attorneys, and service the massive commercial debt simultaneously. The illusion of their wealth was cracking, revealing the hollow, over-leveraged reality underneath. They were desperate, cornered animals. And cornered animals always return to their favorite hunting grounds. Since I had entirely blocked their access to my bank accounts and my phone, they couldn't simply command me to empty my pockets. They needed a massive influx of cash, and they needed collateral to secure it. That was when their eyes inevitably turned toward the quiet, decaying house in the suburbs, Aunt Cora's house. The house was old, but the property it sat on was valuable, and more importantly, it was fully paid off. In their twisted minds, the logic was flawless. Cora was a burden nearing the end of her life, and I was just the obedient caretaker who lived there rent-free. They convinced themselves that sacrificing Cora's only shelter to save Connor's freedom was not just a viable option, but a moral imperative. They believed they could easily steamroll over a sick old woman and a daughter they viewed as fundamentally weak. They were preparing to steal the roof right over our heads. If you've ever had to legally protect yourself from your own family, you know exactly how heavy this kind of realization feels. Drop a 1 in the comments if you stand with keeping the vulnerable safe, because what they tried to do next crossed every line of human decency. I didn't have to wait long for my parents to make their move. The sheer arrogance of their desperation made them sloppy. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, while Cora was resting in her bedroom, I walked out to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. Mixed in with the usual grocery circulars and utility bills was a thick, pristine envelope from a premier commercial real estate appraisal firm in the city. It was addressed to the residents, but the contact name printed on the attention line wasn't Cora's, it was Phaedra's. I stood in the driveway, the crisp autumn wind tugging at my coat, and tore the envelope open. Inside was a comprehensive property valuation report. It included exterior photographs of our house, a detailed market analysis of the neighborhood, and an estimated equity value that was more than enough to cover Connor's legal fees and David's defaulted bank loan. Tucked behind the appraisal was a draft of a listing agreement. They were actively preparing to put the house on the market. But a house cannot be sold by someone who doesn't own it. Aunt Cora's name was the only one on the deed. Phaedra couldn't legally authorize a sale unless she had a signed, notarized power of attorney transferring control of the estate to her. And I knew for a fact that Cora, who could barely hold a spoon due to her arthritis, hadn't signed anything. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity when I walked back inside and checked the caller ID on the landline. There was a missed call from an unfamiliar number. I dialed it back from my cell phone utilizing a blocked caller ID. A man answered, identifying himself as a mobile notary service. I hung up immediately. My parents weren't just planning to sell the house. They were orchestrating a federal crime. Phaedra was hiring a shady notary to legitimize a forged document. She was going to fake her disabled sister's signature to steal the only roof over her head, all to save her golden boy from the consequences of his own criminal actions. The absolute bone-chilling depravity of it took my breath away. They were willing to render a sick, elderly woman entirely homeless to protect their bruised egos and their failing son. I carefully slid the appraisal document back into its envelope. A profound, icy calm settled over my entire nervous system. I didn't feel a shred of daughterly affection left in my body. There was no internal conflict, no lingering guilt about what I was about to do to them. They had crossed a line that erased any remaining moral obligations I held toward them. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of legal theft, assuming I was too weak to stop them. They didn't realize I was already holding the winning hand. The next morning, the sunlight was filtering softly through the kitchen blinds when my cell phone vibrated on the counter. It was Mrs. Vance, my attorney. I picked it up, my heart maintaining a steady, even rhythm. I didn't need to pace the floor. I simply leaned against the cool granite countertop and waited for her to speak. "Good morning, Stella, Mrs." Vance said, her professional tone carrying a distinct note of satisfaction. "I just received the courier packet from the courthouse. The judge reviewed the medical evaluations, the nursing affidavits, and the complete lack of involvement from your parents. Your petition has been approved in its entirety." A massive invisible weight lifted off my shoulders, floating away into the morning air. The court had officially granted me full, irrevocable power of attorney over Aunt Cora's medical decisions and her entire financial estate. I was now her sole legal guardian. The judge had recognized the reality of the situation. I was the only competent adult protecting a vulnerable woman. "What does this mean for any other documents out there?" I asked, needing to hear her confirm the exact mechanics of my shield. "It means you are the absolute authority," Mrs. Vance explained smoothly. "Because the judge ruled that Cora is currently incapacitated and unable to manage her own affairs, any document bearing her signature dated after her medical decline is automatically presumed invalid. If anyone attempts to present a newly signed power of attorney, it is legally void. More importantly, it constitutes clear evidence of forgery." I thanked her, ended the call, and looked down at the official red-stamped digital copy she had just forwarded to my email. This single piece of paper was impenetrable armor. Phaedra and David had spent the last 2 weeks desperately plotting in the shadows, forging signatures and hiring corrupt notaries, completely unaware that their entire scheme was dead on arrival. I printed the document. The printer hummed efficiently, spitting out the thick, legally binding pages. Holding the warm paper in my hands, I felt an unprecedented surge of power. For 26 years, my parents had dictated the terms of my life. They had told me what to do, what to pay for, and how to behave. They had used their parental authority as a weapon to keep me compliant. But the hierarchy had officially inverted. I was no longer a frightened daughter trying to appease impossible masters. I was a legally appointed guardian backed by the full weight of the state Supreme Court, armed with documented proof of their financial liabilities. I walked into Cora's room, adjusted her blankets, and smiled. They were going to come for the house. I knew they would. And I was going to let them walk right through the front door. Before the inevitable confrontation, I needed to ensure every single angle of my trap was flawless. I drove back to Mrs. Vance's office that afternoon, bringing the forged appraisal envelope and the original commercial promissory note Connor had signed. We sat at her mahogany desk reviewing the exact sequence of events that would unfold when my parents made their move. This is where the mechanics of justice become truly beautiful. You see, when someone is manipulating you emotionally, the chaos feels overwhelming, but the law is cold, linear, and utterly devoid of emotion. Mrs. Vance looked over the appraisal and the note, linking her fingers together as she explained the reality of my parents' situation. If your mother attempts to use a forged power of attorney to leverage a mortgage or sell this property, she isn't just dealing with a family dispute, Mrs. Vance detailed. Presenting forged documents to a federally insured financial institution elevates the act to federal bank fraud. It carries severe mandatory minimums. By the time they present it, they will be handing the authorities the very rope to hang them. But the true masterpiece was the $85,000 promissory note. Mrs. Vance pointed to the specific clause I had embedded in the contract. Because you filed this lien before Connor's arrest, you are what the law calls a primary secured creditor. When the state liquidates the pub's assets to pay off its debts, secured creditors get paid first. You are at the very front of the line. I nodded, absorbing the absolute certainty of the process. And what about the bank loan my father signed? I asked. Mrs. Vance offered a sharp, clinical smile. Your father's $120,000 loan is an unsecured commercial debt. The bank is at the back of the line. Once the state sells the pub's inventory and fixtures, that money goes directly into your bank account to satisfy your $85,000. There will be nothing left for the bank. Your parents will be held personally liable for the entire remaining balance of their loan. It was mathematically perfect. My money was safe, legally extracted from the wreckage of Connor's failure. My parents, who had confidently stolen my savings, were about to eat a six-figure debt while facing potential federal fraud charges. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the steel jaws were heavily greased. If you've ever wished you could legally obliterate a toxic person's entitlement with nothing but a stack of paperwork, you know exactly how satisfying this moment was. Would you have snapped right here? Because what I did next wiped the smirk right off her face. If you're ready for the flip, hit that like button. The climax arrived on a dreary Saturday afternoon. The sky was a bruised, heavy gray, perfectly matching the tension that had been building for weeks. I was sitting in the living room quietly reading a book while Cora napped in the adjacent room. The sudden, violent pounding on the front door shattered the silence. It wasn't a polite knock, it was a demand. I didn't rush to answer. I deliberately marked my page, set the book down, and walked to the door with measured steps. When I pulled it open, the porch was crowded. Phaedra stood in the center, flanked by David, and a sleazy-looking man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, carrying a faux leather briefcase. Phaedra's face was a mask of furious entitlement. She didn't say hello, she pushed past me, marching directly into the living room, as if she owned the very floorboards she was stepping on. David and the suited man followed closely behind. "Pack your bags," Stella Phaedra ordered, her voice sharp and echoing off the walls. She turned to face me, her arms crossed in an aggressive stance. "You have 24 hours to get your things out of my house. The movers will be here on Monday to clear out the rest." I closed the front door softly, leaning my back against it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't display a single ounce of the terror she so desperately wanted to see. "This isn't your house, Phaedra. It belongs to Cora." David stepped forward, his face flushed with stress and arrogance. "Not anymore, it doesn't," he sneered. "Cora signed over the rights to us. She knows Connor is in trouble and she did the right thing for the family. We are leveraging the equity to pay off the bank and get your brother the defense attorney he deserves." The suited man opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. He tossed it onto the coffee table with a theatrical flair. "I am representing your parents in this real estate transaction," he stated, his voice oily and rehearsed. That is a legally binding power of attorney signed by Cora authorizing the immediate sale of this property. You have no legal standing here. Vacate the premises or I will have local law enforcement remove you for trespassing." Phaedra smiled a vicious, triumphant smirk. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully weaponized the legal system to crush me and discard her sister in one fell swoop. The room was suffocatingly tense, the air thick with their absolute certainty. They were waiting for me to break, to cry, to beg for a few more days. Instead, I looked at the forged document on the table, and then I looked directly into Phaedra's eyes. "You really should have read what Connor signed," I said quietly. I didn't move toward the coffee table to inspect their forged document. I simply walked over to the small console table by the hallway, opened the top drawer, and pulled out my own sleek black folder. The contrast in our demeanors was stark. They were radiating frantic, aggressive energy. I was operating at the speed of a ticking metronome. I walked back into the living room and handed a crisp, notarized copy of the commercial promissory note directly to David. He snatched at his brow, furrowing as he scanned the dense legal text. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. "That," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, "is the $85,000 commercial loan Connor signed the week before his grand opening. You see, I didn't just give him my life savings. I required collateral. That document explicitly names me as the primary secured creditor, placing a blanket lien on every single asset inside that pub." David's eyes darted across the page, zeroing in on the notary seal and Connor's unmistakable sloppy signature. Phaedra stepped closer to him, trying to read over his shoulder, her triumphant smirk beginning to falter. "The state has already initiated the liquidation process for the pub," I continued, pacing my words so they hit with maximum impact. "Because I am a secured creditor, the liquidation revenue comes to me first. The bar fixtures, the high-end sound system, the inventory, all of it is being sold by the state to reimburse my $85,000 plus penalty interest." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the reality to sink in. I looked at David, watching the color drain entirely from his face. "The $120,000 commercial loan you took out, David, that is unsecured debt," I explained smoothly. "You are at the back of the line. The state will drain the pub to pay me, and there will be absolutely nothing left over for the bank. You are personally liable for the entirety of that debt. You aren't getting a dime from Connor's business, and neither is the bank." "You little bitch," Phaedra hissed, her voice trembling as the financial devastation crashed over her. "You planned this. You set up your own brother. I didn't make him hire undocumented workers, Phaedra," I countered softly. "I didn't make him buy untaxed liquor. I simply insured my investment against his inevitable incompetence. I am getting my money back. You are getting the bill." David dropped the paper onto the table as if it had burned his fingers. The 1-2 punch of Connor's prison sentence and a 6-figure debt was suddenly unavoidably real. But Phaedra wasn't finished. Her survival instinct kicked in, vicious and blind. She pointed a shaking finger at the forged document on the table. "It doesn't matter," she screamed, abandoning all pretense of civility. "We are selling this house. We will pay the bank with Cora's equity. You can't stop this sale." Phaedra refused to process the reality of the $85,000 lien. The human mind has an astonishing capacity for denial when confronted with its own catastrophic failures, and my mother was currently putting on a masterclass in delusion. She snatched the forged power of attorney back from the coffee table, clutching it to her chest like a physical shield against the financial ruin I had just laid out before her. Her face was flushed, her breathing shallow and erratic. She paced across the faded Persian rug, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood. She looked at David, who was still staring blankly at the space where my contract had been completely paralyzed by the realization that his $120,000 bank loan was now an unsecured, inescapable nightmare. Receiving no support from her husband, Phaedra turned her furious gaze back to me. She abandoned the polite, wealthy suburbanite persona entirely. Her voice rose to a shrill, piercing register that echoed off the walls of the quiet house, disturbing the absolute peace I had worked so hard to cultivate for Aunt Cora. "You think a piece of paper about a pub is going to stop me?" Phaedra screamed, waving the forged document in the air. "I am Cora's sister. I have known her my entire life. We share the same blood, the same parents, the same history. I have every legal and moral right to liquidate this rotting house to save my son. This property is family equity, and I am the head of this family." I watched her unravel with a sense of profound clinical detachment. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't try to argue with her twisted logic. She genuinely believed that because she shared DNA with the woman sleeping in the next room, she was automatically entitled to strip her of her only shelter. She viewed Cora not as a human being with rights, but as a dormant bank account waiting to be cracked open to bail out her golden child. She continued to rant, her words becoming more disjointed and venomous. She called me an ungrateful parasite. She accused me of plotting against my own flesh and blood out of sheer petty jealousy. She insisted that once the house was sold, the bank would be paid. Connor's high-priced defense attorney would magically make his federal charges disappear, and their perfect manicured lives would resume exactly as before. She painted a fantasy world where she was the heroic matriarch making tough decisions, and I was just an obstacle to be bulldozed. I let her scream until her throat was raw. I let her exhaust every single manipulation tactic she had spent 26 years perfecting. None of it worked anymore. The emotional buttons she was desperately trying to push had been permanently disconnected. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting lightly at my sides, watching her performance slowly lose its momentum. When she finally paused to catch her breath, panting slightly, the silence in the room rushed back in, heavier and colder than before. She was completely empty. Sensing that Phaedra's hysterical meltdown was entirely ineffective, the sleazy man in the cheap suit finally decided to earn his consulting fee. He stepped in front of my mother, physically placing himself between us to establish a posture of manufactured authority. He buttoned his suit jacket, cleared his throat loudly, and looked down at me with the practiced predatory gaze of a man accustomed to intimidating people into submission. He was the classic bully in a briefcase, relying on legal jargon to mask the absolute illegitimacy of his presence. "Listen to me very carefully, little girl," he began, his voice dropping into a low, menacing baritone. He tapped a thick, stubby finger against the forged power of attorney. Phaedra was still clutching. "I don't care about your little restaurant loans or your sibling rivalry. That document is a legally executed transfer of authority. It bears the signature of the property owner, witnessed and formalized by a licensed notary. That makes your mother the sole decision-maker for this estate." He took a slow, deliberate step forward, invading my personal space in a classic power play. The smell of cheap cologne and stale coffee washed over me. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I held my ground, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact. "You are currently occupying this property without the legal consent of the newly appointed executor," he continued, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "If you do not pack your bags and vacate these premises immediately, I will not hesitate to call the local police. I will have you forcibly removed for criminal trespassing, and given the fragile state of your aunt in the next room, I might just have them look into charges of elder abuse and unlawful confinement." The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. It was a terrifying scenario designed to trigger a panic response. He was threatening to drag me out of my home in handcuffs and leave a severely ill woman in the care of people who actively wished for her demise. Phaedra crossed her arms, a look of vicious triumph returning to her face. David finally stood up, a little straighter, seemingly bolstered by the lawyer's aggressive posturing. They were certain this was the killing blow. They thought the mere mention of law enforcement would send me running out the door in tears. Would you have snapped right here? Because what I did next wiped the smirk right off his face? If you're ready for the flip, hit that like button. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show an ounce of fear. I simply let out a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh of amusement. The trap had been fully triggered and they had locked themselves inside it perfectly. I looked right at him. "You really shouldn't make threats about calling the police," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a heartbeat, "because if you do, they aren't going to be arresting me." I reached back into the sleek black folder resting on the console table. I pulled out the thick, premium weight document Mrs. Vance had handed me just days prior. I didn't toss it. I deliberately handed it directly to the lawyer, forcing him to take it. I watched his eyes drop to the heavy embossed red seal of the state Supreme Court stamped across the front page. That is a formalized, irrevocable power of attorney granted by a superior court judge. I explained, enunciating every syllable with absolute precision. It grants me sole, exclusive legal guardianship over Cora's medical and financial estate. The judge issued this order based on comprehensive medical evaluations, proving that Cora has been entirely incapacitated and incapable of signing any legal documents for the past 6 months. The lawyer's smug expression froze. The color began to rapidly drain from his cheeks, leaving his skin an unhealthy ashen gray. He stared at the red seal as if it were highly radioactive, which means I continued stepping slightly closer to him. The document Phaedra is holding is a verifiable forgery. And because you just walked into my home and attempted to use a forged document to force a real estate transaction and threaten a legal guardian, you have officially crossed the threshold into federal conspiracy and bank fraud. I lifted my hand and pointed casually toward the top shelf of the living room bookcase. Tucked discreetly between two heavy hardcover novels was a small blinking red light. I installed security cameras to monitor Cora's nurses while I'm at work, I said softly. The camera has recorded audio and video of this entire interaction. It recorded Phaedra presenting a forged signature, and it recorded you attempting to extort a property transfer using that forgery. I already have the local precinct and the federal fraud division on speed dial. The lawyer didn't say a single word. He didn't try to argue. He didn't look at Phaedra or David. The realization that he had just jeopardized his license, his freedom, and his entire career for a desperate suburban couple hit him with the force of a freight train. He shoved the Supreme Court order back into my chest, practically throwing it at me. He turned on his heel, his cheap shoes slipping slightly on the rug, and bolted for the front door. He didn't look back. He sprinted down the driveway, threw himself into his car, and sped away, leaving black tire marks on the asphalt. Phaedra and David stood in the center of the living room, completely defenseless. Their hired gun had abandoned them. Their forged weapon was useless. Their financial ruin was absolutely guaranteed. They looked at me, realizing for the first time that the quiet, compliant daughter they had abused for a decade had meticulously engineered their total destruction. I opened the front door and gestured to the driveway. They walked out silently. The legal system moves slowly, but when it finally arrives, it crushes everything in its path with mechanical efficiency. A month after my parents walked out of Cora's house for the last time, the consequences of their arrogance materialized completely. Connor stood before a federal judge, stripped of his designer clothes and his unearned bravado. Without the massive equity from Cora's house to hire a miracle-working defense team, his public defender could do nothing but negotiate a plea deal. Connor was sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security federal facility for extensive economic fraud, severe labor code violations, and possession of illicit, untaxed goods. The golden child, the boy who had been handed the world on a silver platter, wept openly in the courtroom as the bailiffs placed him in handcuffs. Phaedra sat in the gallery sobbing into a tissue while David stared blankly at the floor, looking 10 years older than his actual age. Simultaneously, the state liquidation board executed their mandate on the pub. Every velvet booth, every premium bottle of liquor, and the high-end sound system were auctioned off, just as Mrs. Vance had promised. The law recognized my commercial promissory note as the absolute priority. The state wired the funds directly into my newly secured, deeply encrypted business account. I recovered my entire $85,000 plus a substantial amount in penalty interest. But the true devastation fell squarely on Phaedra and David. Because the pub's liquidated assets went entirely to me, the bank holding David's $120,000 commercial loan was left with absolutely nothing. The bank immediately called in the debt. David and Phaedra's sprawling, perfectly manicured house in the gated community had been put up as collateral. The foreclosure notices arrived by certified mail a week later. They lost the house. They lost the country club memberships, they lost the premium cable, and the imported vanilla candles. They were forced to declare personal bankruptcy and move into a cramped, dark apartment on the outskirts of the city. Furthermore, the local authorities had opened a preliminary civil investigation into the forged power of attorney document they had tried to use on me. Though they hadn't been criminally charged yet, the legal fees just to keep themselves out of prison were draining whatever meager savings they had left. The empire they had built on my back had crumbled into dust. They had sacrificed their daughter, abandoned their sister, and enabled a criminal, all to maintain an illusion of superiority. Now the illusion was gone, and they were left with nothing but the bleak, suffocating reality of their own choices. I didn't attend Connor's sentencing to gloat. I didn't drive past their foreclosed house to revel in their misery. I simply watched the wire transfer clear in my bank account, closed my laptop, and went to make Cora a warm bowl of oatmeal. The ledger was balanced. My final interaction with my mother happened entirely by chance outside the county courthouse. I had been inside filing the final routine paperwork to permanently solidify my guardianship over Cora's estate. As I walked down the wide concrete steps toward my car, a figure stepped out from the shadow of a large oak tree. It was Phaedra. She looked unrecognizable. The immaculate, expensive highlights in her hair had faded to a dull, brassy gray. Her designer coat looked slightly too large for her, hanging off her shoulders in a way that suggested she hadn't been sleeping or eating well. She looked frail, desperate, and entirely broken. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears, and she rushed forward, stopping just a few feet away. "Stella, please." She practically begged, her voice cracking with a vulnerability I had never heard from her before. "Please, we have nothing. Connor is gone. Your father is entirely consumed by the bankruptcy. We are living in a nightmare. You have your money back. You have the house. Please, just come see us. Help us figure this out. We are your family. We need you." It was the ultimate desperate play of a manipulator who had lost all her leverage. She was trying to resurrect the ghost of the obedient daughter, hoping that somewhere deep inside I still craved her maternal approval enough to save her from the wreckage she had created. But looking at her standing there on the concrete, shivering slightly in the wind, I didn't feel a surge of pity. I didn't feel anger either. I felt a profound, vast emptiness regarding her existence. I stopped walking and looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. I didn't yell. I didn't list out her crimes or demand an apology I knew would be fake anyway. I kept my voice perfectly level, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had survived the fire and emerged entirely fireproof. Family is composed of the people who protect you when the storm hits. Phaedra, I said the words cutting through the crisp air. Family does not forge legal documents to steal a dying woman's home. Family does not bleed their children dry to fund their own vanity. You didn't lose a daughter. You never wanted a daughter. You just lost your ATM and the machine is permanently out of service. She gasped, a sharp, ragged sound as if I had physically struck her. She reached a hand out toward me, but I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I just looked at her extended hand, entirely unmoved by the theatrical display of her grief. I had spent 26 years trying to fill the void in her heart, only to realize the void was bottomless. I turned away from her, walked to my car, and unlocked the door. I didn't look in the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the courthouse parking lot. I drove toward home. Spring arrived with a quiet, undeniable brilliance. The heavy gray clouds that had seemed to hang over the city for months finally broke, giving way to sharp, clear blue skies. The change in the season mirrored the profound shift in my own reality. With my $85,000 securely back in my possession, multiplied by the interest the state had seized, I didn't just rebuild my safety net, I built an entirely new foundation. I quit my exhausting, soul-draining job managing the restaurant. Using my capital, my accounting expertise, and the brutal legal education I had just received, I opened my own boutique financial consulting firm. I rented a bright, airy office space with large windows overlooking a park. I specialized in helping individuals, primarily women, untangle themselves from financial abuse, secure their assets, and establish ironclad legal boundaries against toxic family members. I was using the darkness of my past to build a lighthouse for others. But my greatest achievement wasn't the plaque on my office door. It was the transformation of the quiet house in the suburbs. I hired contractors to completely renovate the ground floor. We widened the doorways for wheelchair access, installed a state-of-the-art walk-in therapeutic tub, and upgraded the entire HVAC system to ensure the air was perfectly clean and climate-controlled. I spent an entire weekend painting Cora's room myself. I chose a soft, warm, buttery yellow, a color that caught the morning light and made the room feel like a permanent sunrise. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the scent of the lavender bushes I had planted outside her window. One Sunday morning, I sat at the kitchen island, a hot mug of coffee resting in my hands. The house was peaceful. The steady, quiet hum of Cora's new high-end oxygen concentrator sounded like a gentle metronome. Cora was sitting in her specialized recliner, looking out the window at the blooming garden, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. She looked safe. She looked protected. My phone sat on the counter next to me. It didn't ring with demands. It didn't vibrate with frantic texts from a golden child or a narcissistic mother. The silence was no longer a void waiting to be filled with anxiety. It was a canvas I could paint my own life on. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The heavy, invisible chains of familial duty were gone, replaced by the profound, quiet joy of a life built on actual love and mutual respect. I was finally truly free. The journey from being the family scapegoat to becoming the architect of my own life taught me a lesson that fundamental biology tries to hide. We are conditioned from birth to believe that the people who share our genetics are the ultimate authority on our worth. We are told to endure their cruelty, their financial exploitation, and their emotional neglect simply because they carry the title of mother, father, or brother. But titles do not equal character. Looking back at the wreckage Phaedra, David, and Connor had created, I realized that my survival depended entirely on my willingness to burn the bridge they were forcing me to stand on. If I had stayed, if I had continued to play the role of the reliable silent rock, they would have drained my bank accounts to zero and left Aunt Cora to die in an underfunded state facility. They would have consumed my entire existence without a second thought. And they would have called it family duty. I learned that true power doesn't come from yelling or throwing fits. True power comes from absolute meticulous preparation. It comes from keeping a paper trail, understanding your legal rights, and recognizing that boundaries without consequences are merely suggestions. When the time came, I didn't need to argue with them to prove my worth. I simply let the undeniable weight of the law and the consequences of their own actions crush their delusions. My life now is defined by a quiet, unshakable peace. The consulting firm is thriving, helping dozens of clients find the same financial liberation I fought for. Aunt Cora is living her final years surrounded by warmth, dignity, and absolute safety. I sleep through the night unbothered by the ghosts of the people who tried to use me as a stepping stone. You don't owe your life to the people who gave you breath, especially if they only try to suffocate you with it. If this story brought you some peace, share it with someone who needs to hear that setting boundaries isn't a betrayal, it's survival. Subscribe for more stories, and I'll see you next time. The screen fades to black.